I talk too fast, then just tell me you're talking too fast, and I'll slow down. But I'm also conscious that we have a time limit, and that when it comes to Lady Zaynab, I could talk for hours and hours, and so eventually you will have to say, now it is enough. And afterwards we could give a little context to this. The question of Zaynab arose. There were 4 Catholic priests in Rome, all members of the Islamic Arabic faculty, sitting around a table at lunch complaining about the Muslims. Our complaint was, why do they never write about their great women? Fatima, Zaynab, Kulthum. Why does nobody write? So all 4 of us each agreed each of us would write about one of the women. And I immediately took Zaynab because she is the daughter of Fatima. I said, I'll do Zaynab. The other 3 haven't done anything yet, but the Zaynab book is finished and I hope will be published quite soon. So, talking about Zaynab, as a context, there is obviously a great deal of devotion to Zaynab in the Shi'i world and in the Islamic world generally, but there is very little academic work on the life of Zaynab. Lots of stories about her holiness and her bravery, but very few books written at an in-depth academic level. My second issue is that there has been some reinterpretation of Zaynab. So around the time of the Iranian Revolution, some of the authors there began to rewrite the life of Zaynab, and I am not convinced that they did justice to the real Zaynab, because what they did was they revisited her life and turned her into a revolutionary and a heroine who seemed to have no fear of anything or anybody. But I am not convinced that when you read the classical sources, both the Sunni and the Shi'i sources, I'm not sure that that's the true picture of Zaynab. And so partly my reason for writing about Zaynab was to try and rediscover the true picture of Zaynab, to put her back into the grasp of ordinary people who could copy her life and copy some of her virtues. So when I talk about a Zaynabian theology, and I invented this, there's no such thing as Zaynabian theology, but it's my own invention. When I talk about a Zaynabian theology, I'm talking about presenting the life of Zaynab in such a way that people could actually copy her virtues. Put her back into the hands of ordinary people, because not every human being is as deeply engaged with struggles for justice as was al-Hussein. Most of us live very ordinary lives and our battles are much smaller. But we want to be able to use Zaynab as our model even in the small battles of daily life. I want her to be an ordinary human being, a great blessed member of the Ahl Bayt, but nonetheless not a fearless revolutionary, but an ordinary woman who felt fear and grief, but who was able at the same time to take a stand for justice. So that's the first context. The second context is that what I'm talking about tonight is one moment of her life, and that is the moment that Zaynab stood in front of the terrible Ibn Ziyad. Many people think that the Caliph Yazid was bad. I think Ziad was worse for various reasons. And I think he was more guilty than was Yazid. I think they're both terrible people, and they were both also psychologically unbalanced people, but Ziad in some ways was worse. And I use as my base text for this I don't want to go there yet, the work by the Sunni historian called Tabari. So Tabari has written this famous work of history, the Kitab Akhbar, Rusul wal Maluk. It's the chronicles of the kings and the prophets. It's translated in about 30 volumes or more in English, so it's readable. And I have followed Tabari as an outline of the moments that Zaynab spent before Karbala, during Karbala, and then immediately after Karbala. And although I think that Tabari makes some mistakes about his presentation of Zaynab, and I've corrected those mistakes, I think, I might be wrong though, he is a very good scheme to follow if you want to find the life of Zaynab. And so this is the chronology that I followed in my studies of Zaynab. The first thing is, there is a moment before Karbala at a place called Huzaymiyah. And at Huzaymiyah, Zaynab hears voices at night. Now, hearing voices on the night air is a very, very famous theme that runs through many of the Shia works. But Zaynab hears voices that she doesn't understand, and she has to ask her brother al-Hussein what they mean. The reason that I'm interested in this moment is that even though Tabari doesn't have it in his writings, this gives us a very good picture of what was going on in Zaynab's mind before Karbala. She was terrified. She was not a heroic visionary going into battle. At this moment, I don't think that Zaynab fully understood what was happening. I think it was slowly beginning to work out in her mind that the predictions of her brother's death were now coming true. But before the battle, I'm not sure that Zaynab was absolutely clear where it was heading. And hearing these voices at night, she is terrified by what she hears. Then secondly, on the night, or maybe the afternoon, after Salaat Asr, Zaynab hears the noise of the army coming, the enemy army. And again, she has a breakdown. She is terrified by what she hears. And she goes to her brother Hussein, who the texts say is sitting in front of his tent, cleaning his sword. In fact, he's not. He's asleep in his chair, dreaming about his grandfather, because he has a dream of Muhammad at that moment, and he wakes and he tells her. But Zaynab at that moment is terrified and goes to ask him, have you not heard? The enemy army is right here. They're approaching. The third moment is that Zaynab hears this lament that Hussein sings in front of his tent, and it's a lament about those who will be dead by tomorrow, and she has a breakdown. A mental and physical breakdown. Her nephew, the fourth Imam, Zain al-Abidin, says in the text, she is a woman. Women do this. They have breakdowns. But I think it's much more serious than that. I think it's still showing us that this pre-Karbala Zaynab is a woman who is not yet aware of what's about to happen. The fourth moment is after the battle has already begun. And it is the first emergence of Zaynab from her tent onto the battlefield. And it happens when Hussein's son, Ali al-Akbar, is killed. Now, there is a big dispute among the Shia scholars as to which son was which. There were three sons present at the battle called Ali. And there is a dispute between authors like Saduq and Mufid about which one was killed, how old he was, who was the fourth Imam. My understanding is that Ali al-Akbar was the oldest son, and he must have been close to 30 at the time that he was killed at Karbala. His father, after all, was close to 60. So it is unlikely that his father had no sons older than 20. I think Ali al-Akbar was the oldest son, the oldest of the three, and he was about 30 when he was killed. His death brings Zaynab out of her tent onto the field of battle, and all of the scholars, Shia and Sunni, describe her as like the sun rising. She is not the same woman as she was the night before. The night before she was terrified. Now she enters onto the battlefield with some transformed personality and force. Something has happened overnight to Zaynab to transform her. And almost all of the scholars say she looked like the sun as it rises. The fifth incident is the emergence of a young boy whose face is like the splinter of the moon, and one of his sandal straps is broken. This is a very important detail. When people notice little things like a broken sandal strap, you can trust that they are really good eyewitnesses. And the reason I mention this is because this was another nephew, almost certainly of al-Hussein. This was one of his brother al-Hassan's sons. But Zaynab does not react to his death, and it is a puzzle. She reacted to the first nephew being killed. She doesn't react to the second nephew. And then the sixth moment is the dreadful killing of Hussein's infant son. So we've lost the oldest, now we're losing the youngest, Abdullah al-Hussein, sitting on the knee of his father maybe, or in his father's arms. And the reason I include it is because some of the Shia texts include Zaynab in this, but others omit her presence when this little boy is killed. the next event is the emergence of another boy, maybe another nephew. And Hussein orders Zaynab to pull him back into the tents. And the boy will always be remembered for the stand he took and for the exceptionally rude name that he called the man who would eventually kill him, called him son. Well, he calls him a very insulting name as he dies. This is another nephew, but Zaynab, in her second emergence from her tent, is unable to stop this boy. He says, I will not be separated from my uncle. So we know immediately this is another nephew who is killed. Then her third and final emergence is to challenge her brother's murderers at the very moment that they are killing Hussein. And she stands outside on the battlefield and she says, is there not a Muslim among you? As they very reluctantly, because nobody seems to want to be the one who kills Hussein, until finally the army commanders order them forward and they kill Hussein. On the same day, so we're talking about Friday the 10th of Muharram, on the same day, the head of Hussein and of some, maybe all, but we're not sure, some of his killed companions are sent away immediately to Ibn Ziad, who is in Kufa. On the next day, Saturday the 11th of Muharram, the bodies are buried. And on the third day, Sunday the 12th of Muharram, the women, including Zaynab and including Zayn al-Abidin, who has been sick and is still very sick, they are depart together as prisoners, mounted on camels without any head covering the woman. They are sent to Kufa from Karbala. And there is recorded by Tabari this magnificent lament that Zaynab sings, Muhammad, may the angels of heaven bless you. One of the most beautiful laments in all of the Shia writings. But unfortunately, Tabari says she sung it as they were leaving and as they passed the bodies. But we've already heard that the bodies are already buried. I think Tabari has made a mistake. I think that Zaynab sung that lament on the day of Karbala as the women were driven from their tents, which had been set on fire by the enemy, and saw the bodies of her brother and all the others. And then they get to Kufa, and this is what I hope we'll finally get to talk about tonight. This is her first protest. People talk about a sermon. It wasn't a sermon. It was what in Arabic is called ihtijaj. It was a protest against the people of Kufa who had remained silent and thus had betrayed her brother. And her first big encounter with a ruler, and that is with Ibn Ziyad. And then finally, they will be moved to the court of Yazid, and there will be her second protest. So, if Zaynab functions as the model, the archetype of resistance against injustice, it is at this moment, when she steps into the court of Ibn Ziyad, that she takes on this role. So Ibn Ziyad, at the time of Karbala, was a man of about 30. And he would die 6 or 7 years after his encounter with this daughter of Ali. But standing before him, Zaynab is going to defend her brother as competently as anybody could ever defend him. And not only that, she's going to take physical steps to save the life of her young nephew, Ali bin al-Hussein, who is still very sick and who is the 4th Imam. So her words, together with a physical action of shielding him, is going to preserve the truth of Karbala, but I think much more than that, she saved the Imamate because she didn't allow him to kill the 4th Imam. And Tabari has this drama that takes place in a number of steps. So first of all, the heads of the killed and the survivors are brought before Ibn Ziyad in his palace in Kufa. But it's very difficult to know whether they're all brought together, the heads and the survivors, or whether the heads are already there in his presence when the woman and the children are brought in. So Tabari thinks all together, but the great Shia scholar Ibn Ta'us says no, the heads were there already when the woman and the children were brought in. Ziad is seated already in his palace for a public meeting. The head of Hussein is placed before him. We know that he interferes with the head in a very bad way and is challenged by more than one person. And then the women and children are ushered into his presence. So we can work this out, that the heads were dispatched immediately after the battle. They would have arrived in Kufa on the day of Ashura, maybe in the evening. We know the names of the men who carried the heads, and we know that at least one of them, a man whose name was Khawali, arrived with the head of Hussein to the house of his wife. And his wife says to him, "Most heroes come home with silver and gold, and you have come home bringing the head of the grandson of the Prophet of Islam." And she expels him from the house. So he leaves the head under a tub or under a dish, and he goes and sleeps in the house of one of his other wives because the palace is locked. So the heads arrive the day after Karbala, which means it's unlikely that the woman would have arrived already. It would have been a much longer journey for them. Whether or not the heads were there or not, or whether they were all brought in together, the one thing that we can say about Yazid is that he did make some small effort to shield the little children. So Kulthum and Fatima, the daughters of Hussein, he made some effort to shield them from the sight of their father's head. Ziad does no such thing. And this, in one way, for me, makes Ziad more brutal than Yazid. Ibn Ziyad then begins this dialogue with Zaynab, because Zaynab enters in dressed in very shabby clothing. She sits among her maid servants, and 3 times Ziyad wants to know who this woman is, and he receives no answer to his question. So Tabari says that Ziyad noticed her because she dared to sit down before he gave permission for her to sit down. And so he says, "Who is that seated woman?" Calls her the seated woman in his presence. But Khawarizmi, who is a Sunni author who writes this beautiful maqtal about the death of Hussein, Khawarizmi says, no, Zaynab came in and gave him a very bad look, and then she sat down. And he noticed this woman who looked so badly at him, then sitting down. And then there are other scholars who said she sat on the far side of the palace. So he immediately was wondering who these women were. I'm not sure, because I'm not a brilliant Arabist, I'm not sure if Ibn Ziyad's question, "Who is this seated one?" is addressed to Zaynab or about Zaynab. Many of the texts say Zaynab made no reply, which makes me think that he was speaking to her. But other texts suggest that he was asking the people around him. And finally, there is a maid who is going to stand up and say, "This is Zaynab, daughter of Fatima." She doesn't call him daughter of Ali. She calls him daughter of Fatima, which suggests to me that Ali at that moment was seen as a political enemy, but Fatima's name had great power in the court of Ibn Ziyad. And it is for this reason that she deliberately, the maidservant, reminds Ziyad, "You are dealing with the daughter of the daughter of the Prophet of God." Just in a number of texts, she is called daughter of Fatima. Sometimes she is called sister of Hussein. It's interesting that the great Shia scholar Saduq, in his Amali, which is his dictations, he omits lots of these details, and it's very curious to know why he wouldn't talk about her clothing and her disguise and the questions. But there are others like Sheikh al-Mufid in his Irshad, and Tabarsi and Irbili, other Shia scholars who fill out the picture. So the third act then begins with this conversation between Ziad and Zaynab. And it begins with Ziad speaking to her. Now, in Ziyad's court, he talks to Zaynab first, and then he talks to Zayn al-Abidin. In Yazid's palace, he talks to Zayn al-Abidin first, and then he talks to Zaynab. The interesting thing for me is both of these men recognize the 2 outstanding personalities. Of all the people in the room, they pick out these 2, one woman and one young man, to talk to. And it suggests to me something about the power that Zaynab had at this moment. And Ziyad begins his conversation with the words, "Alhamdulillah, praise be to God." And Zaynab is going to respond by saying exactly the same thing. But he has a question for her. He says to her, how do you see things now? And she makes this famous answer, I see nothing but beauty. And I know that this is deep in the hearts of the Shia community, but I'm not convinced that she actually said this, because it doesn't occur in any of the classical scholars except for one. Only one scholar records that answer. The other scholars all record a much longer answer. So I followed a Saduq in his Amali. So Ziad says, praise be to God who has disgraced you, plural, all of you, Ahl Bayt, and killed you, Ahl Bayt, all of you, and shown that you're all liars, Ahl Bayt. Zainab replies, praise be to God who has honored us with Muhammad and has cleansed us. And then she quotes Quran 33, has cleansed us with this thorough cleansing. Instead, the one who God disgraces is the dissolute one, the deviant one. She's talking about Ziad. She's saying, you're a deviant. God has honored us and he has disgraced you. So Ziad then says to her, that's the verse which you know well. Ziad then says to her, how do you see what God has done with you, plural, people of the house? He's talking to Zaynab alone, and it seems to me at that moment that the whole of the Ahl Bayt is being carried by her, represented by her. And he says to her alone, you people of the house, as though she is, at that moment at least, the representative of the Ahl Bayt. How do you see it? This is when some people say she said, I see nothing but beauty. In fact, what she said was, to be killed was written for them or prescribed for them. They have gone to their places of rest and God will bring them together with you. And then there is this lovely exchange of Arabic verbs. So you, Ziad, you and your people, you are going to meet in front of God with Al-Hussein and his people, and then you are going to dispute among yourselves. It is difficult to know exactly how we can translate these verbs. So there is one scholar who says that she responded, I see nothing but beauty. And that's, Khawarizmi in his Maqtal has this, and Ibn Ta'us also has this, but all the other scholars, for some reason, admit it. The end of her phrase is about what's going to happen on the Day of Judgment, and this is for those who like to play around with Arabic, just because, well, I put it up for you anyway. So the idea is that on the last day, Ziad and all his people are going to appear before God together with Hussein and his Ahl Bayt, and they will dispute before God, or they will summon each other before God. There are different verbs that are used, or they will quarrel together before God. But in almost all the cases, it's groups of people before God who are going to have this conversation. Only one or two have it in the singular. You, Yazid, you're going to be before God and you're going to argue with God. You're going to dispute with God. You're going to try and tell God that you were right. So one of all of the Shia scholars makes it sound as though it is Ziad alone who one day will dare to try to tell God that what he did was right. So that's Ibn Ta'us again who has that. Are we all right for time? We're not running out, are we? No. Just tell me when we run out of time. So the fourth act of the drama opens with this huge angry outburst from Ibn Ziyad. So he's furious with Zaynab and her response, so furious that it looks as though he wants to kill her. The Arabic doesn't say he wants to kill her. The Arabic says, Hamma biha. He has evil plot against her, an evil plan against her. And there is a man in the room called Amr bin Hurayth who is forced to calm him down. Amr bin Hurayth is a very strange man because he is responsible for the death of many members of the Ahl Bayt. He was maybe the chief of Ziyad's police. And we can't understand why he wants to save Zaynab, because he has been one of the chief people in opposing al-Hussein. But he intervenes at this moment. So Ibn Ziyad, this is Tabari's version, Ibn Ziyad fumes with rage and Amr bin Hurayth says, may God bless the governor. She's just a woman. Don't blame a woman for talking nonsense. Don't censure a woman or blame her for talking nonsense before you. So it's a terrible insult against women, specifically because at that moment she's not just a woman, she's an extraordinary personality, and she is the only one in the room who's talking the truth. But nonetheless, it saves the life of Zaynab. And Ziad says to her, God has cured my soul. God has healed me from your tyrannical brother. And she replies, if killing my brother cures you or heals you, then consider yourself cured. You must be healed by now. And then there is a little conversation about poetry and bravery. He says to her, you're very brave. So there is this sudden change in Ziad. From really angry and ready to kill her, now he begins to praise Zaynab. He says, you're very brave. This, what you've just said, this is bravery. Your father was a brave man, and he was a poet. So now he's suddenly turning to praise Ali. Your father was a brave man and a poet. And she replies, I'm not interested in bravery. What has a woman got to do with bravery? I'm much too distracted to be interested in bravery. What interests me about this is, let me just move forward, is that not all the texts agree. So some texts say, have Ziad saying, this is real bravery. Other texts have a similar Arabic word. He says to her, you're a real poet. Your father was also a poet. I'm not sure which of the texts is right, but I suspect that it's the first version, that he declares, this is bravery. Your father was a poet and he was a brave man. But the other texts say, this is real poetry. Your father was also a great poet. And there's a dispute in the scholars as to what exactly he said. I will try to finish soon. Then there is the most moving part of this drama. And suddenly Ibn Ziyad sees the fourth Imam, who until this moment has been silent. The silence of Zayn al-Abidin begins at the end of the Battle of Karbala and lasts for the whole of his life. Zayn al-Abidin hardly ever speaks. Even in front of Yazid, Yazid keeps attacking him and saying, what's the problem with you that you don't answer me? But at this moment, for some reason, he turns his attention, Ziad, away from Zaynab, and he looks at this very young, very sickly Zayn al-Abidin. I think this, and I might be wrong, because you have a lived experience of Shia Islam that I don't have. I think this is the moment that he begins to be Imam. That this is the moment that Zaynab is going to begin to step back, and Zayn al-Abidin is going to begin to take the place that she has been keeping safe for him. But this is just my own opinion. So Ziad mentions him, sees him, and expresses doubt whether he's a man. It's a very brutal passage that Ziad has him examined by one of his soldiers because he thinks if he's a man, we'll kill him, and if he's a boy, we'll let him live. And so he has Zayn al-Abidin examined, and the soldier says he is a man. And this is when Ziad says, then kill him, and this is when both Zaynab and Zayn al-Abidin act together. So it's a problematic passage because it gives us a difficulty in trying to work out his age. I think that Zayn al-Abidin at Karbala must have been around 22 or 23. Couldn't have been younger than that. So you have 29 or 30-year-old Ali al-Aqba, then you have the middle son who is the future Imam, maybe 23, and then you have the little infant boy who is killed in his father's arms. I think that is the correct, and I think the only one who gets it right is Sheikh Mufid. Mufid gets the ages of the sons right. So Ibn Ziyad doubts whether he's a man, and when he says he must be killed, Ali bin Hussein will challenge him. And I've followed the strands of Tabari here because he's got two ways of telling the story. So in the first way, Ziad looks at him, demands that his adulthood be checked physically, and when it is checked, his execution is ordered. And this is the first time that Ali speaks, and he quotes Quran at Ziad. And Ziad is absolutely furious that this boy quotes Quran at him. And it convinces him. He says, he's quoting the Quran, he must be a man, so kill him. It seems that his ability to quote Quran convinces Ziad that he is no longer a child but an adult. The interesting thing is, later in Yazid's court, they are going to exchange quotes. At one stage, he will quote Quran at Yazid, and Yazid will tell his own son, answer him. But Yazid's son cannot quote the Quran. He doesn't know it. And Yazid has to help his own son to quote a simple verse back at the fourth Imam. So now, truly angry that this boy has quoted Quran at him, he orders his execution. And Ali, the fourth Imam, says to him, if we are kin, you and I, if there is any kinship between us, you can kill me if you want to, but you have to look after these women. It will be your responsibility to care for them. And then there is this moment when perhaps Ibn Ziyad says, you're that man. Ibn Ziyad at this moment recognizes the imamate, in a sense, of Zayn al-Abidin, because Zayn al-Abidin says, you must send a trustworthy Muslim, and he says, you're the man. And his life is saved, and the imamate is secure. The second strand is similar. It's the same sort of conversation. It's just a little more detailed. And in the second strand, we have some added additions. And specifically, we have Zaynab's physical attempt to save him. So it's the same conversation. Check that he's a man. If he's a man, kill him. He is a man, then kill him. The quote of the Quran from the fourth Imam, his anger, Ziyad's anger, that he should quote the Quran. I want to read you the first part of the account that comes from Abu Mikhnaf. Mikhnaf is a very good transmitter of Karbala. I was standing, not Abu Mikhnaf, the man he's transmitting him. I was standing by Ibn Ziyad when Ali bin al-Hussein was displayed before him. Ibn Ziyad said to him, what is your name? Doesn't ask that of Zaynab. He says, who is this woman? But this boy says, what is your name? And he replied, I am Ali bin al-Hussein. Ziyad says, but no, you can't be. Did not God kill Ali bin al-Hussein? And then the boy remains silent. So Ibn Ziyad says to him, Ma laka la tatakalam. What's wrong with you that you don't speak to me? And the boy says, I had a brother who was also called Ali bin al-Hussein, but the people killed him. He's talking about his older brother, whose death had taken place at Karbala. Ziyad replies, no, actually God killed him. And Ali remains silent again. And the second time, Ziyad says to him, what's the matter with you that you do not speak to me? And then he quotes Quran. God receives men's souls at the time of their death. No soul can die except by God's leave. And Ziyad says, you're as bad as the rest of them. I think you're an adult, and orders the soldier to check him. It is an extraordinarily beautiful moment when Ali laments the loss of his older brother. The people killed him, and when Ziyad suggests it was God, Ali defends the truth. It wasn't God who killed him, it was the people who killed him. At this moment, Zaynab intervenes and says, isn't our blood enough for you? So the execution order is given to her nephew, and she throws herself over him and says to Ziyad, isn't our blood already sufficient? Have you not shed enough of our blood? Will you not spare any of us? And at that moment, I think that the imamate is secure. At that moment, Zaynab has saved the life of the fourth Imam. It's not the first time his life was saved. He was saved once before on the field of Karbala by one of his great enemies, one of the army leaders attacking the Ahl Bayt. But this time, he is saved by his aunt Zaynab. The other texts have a variety of details, but we don't have time for them, so we must continue. And then, to conclude, this is the moment when Zaynab begins to end her role. She's stepping back into history. She's still going to make a great speech in the Caliph's court, Yazid, but her role is disappearing. She is doing what she was meant to do, and that is stepping back after having really carried the truth of Karbala and carried the Imamate for a few moments. I'm never sure how to end this, but let me end it this way. The first thing, three things. The first thing is that Zaynab did not cause Ibn Ziyad or Yazid to step back or reduce them to silence or defeat them because she was a strong woman. I don't believe that. She reduced them to silence because she was speaking the truth, and they were not. That's what caused her to be victorious. She was, even in front of the Caliph, having breakdowns and weeping and terrified of what might happen. But she was speaking the truth, and it is the truth that caused both Ziad and Yazid eventually to have to step back. She silenced her enemy because she had justice on her side, and justice always proves victorious, eventually, no matter how powerful the enemy may be. Second point, just for a few moments, a few days, the whole of Shia Islam was defended and articulated and guaranteed by a single woman. There was no one else for a few days except for Zaynab. All the other girls were too young, and Zayn al-Abidin was too sick. So for a period of maybe 3 or 4 days, the whole of Shia Islam is carried by this granddaughter of Muhammad. I have asked a number of Shia scholars, with great fear and trembling, because it's a very difficult question, whether she had the characteristics of the Imam in those days, because it's a difficult question. If in those 3 or 4 days Zaynab was Shia Islam's defender and leader and protector, did God perhaps give to her in those days some of the qualities of Imamate? And so this is a question that I will leave for you to think about. But for me as a non-Muslim, as a Christian, there is a very good parallel in the Christian gospel story of the resurrection, when for a few days a woman called Mary Magdalene was the only one who knew what was going on. And she was the first one to go and speak to the men and explain it to them. She carried the whole truth on her shoulders just for a few days. And finally, I think it's very nice to search the academic life of Zaynab, to recapture her, but for me, much more important is that I would like her to be restored to a place of prominence in the Shia and the Islamic community generally. As somebody who can be loved and imitated by ordinary men and women who are not fighting great battles, just living ordinary lives, who are pouring out their lives just by being faithful to daily things, but no less in some way heroes than are those who died on the day of Karbala. I would like to see her restored to that as a woman who can be imitated by any Muslim, no matter what battles they are fighting in their lives. I better stop there.
Thank you very much. I don't think we have time for questions, as we have prayers now.
Absolutely, I'm sorry.
Am I right in saying that you have to leave now?
Yes, I'm not a night owl. I go to bed early, and so I tried to persuade Kumail that I would leave afterwards.
Okay. Well then, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for that excellent presentation on Zaynab. Salawat.